So kids, make sure that your moms and dads check the registration days in your community. Remember, boys and girls, it's their duty and privilege to vote. Make sure that mom and dad do.
Voting is at the heart both of the way Americans think about our country and also the reality of our political landscape and the history of who is allowed in the voting booth in the United States, of how the franchise has expanded and sometimes contracted, is a very interesting one, sometimes inspiring, sometimes upsetting. Since we can't cover all the twists and turns and important events in the history of voting rights in the United States, we're just going to concentrate on 3 or 4 incidents. I'll be drawing a moral or a lesson from each of these. Unlike Aesop's famous fables, these incidents are actually true. Of course, the morals or the lessons of them are open to your interpretation. The Democrats ran on a platform of restoring peace quickly, allowing the South back on virtually any terms. Members of the Democratic Party were caught trying to cheat. They were stuffing hundreds and hundreds of pro-democratic absentee ballots into ballot boxes and satchels. Here's the part that most surprised me when I learned it. The North, the Union, did the same thing. With Lincoln's knowledge and consent, Republicans also tried to cheat to win the election. Everything they could to allow soldiers they believed were pro-Republican to vote. They would give them furloughs. They would give them a week off. Whereas soldiers, or even groups of soldiers that they believed were pro-democratic, they refused to give them furloughs to try and prevent them from voting. Political history is too complex to divide individuals into good guys and bad guys. But still, I think of Lincoln as one of the heroes. Even the good guys will attempt to cheat and steal elections if they think that the ends justify the means. What happened in the American South after the Civil War is very strange and hard to understand. North, the Union, had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives in order to preserve the United States as one nation without slavery. As you know, the North won that war, and yet within a dozen years, Northern troops withdrew from the South, and white dominance and racial segregation was reestablished. It's as if after the victory of the Allies in Europe in World War II, as if the United States had said to Germany, listen, go ahead, you can do just what you were doing before. Just make some cosmetic changes, give things different names. How could the Union have been willing to just give up on the goals of the Civil War after winning? It had something to do with similarities in what happened next in both the North and the South. The Southern story is probably more familiar. Although the 15th Amendment prohibited openly disenfranchising African American citizens, as you probably know, the South used a variety of mechanisms to get around this. African Americans in the South were arrested for many so-called offenses that wouldn't have been crimes for white people. For the first time, those with a criminal record were not allowed to vote. Before this, it had been thought that civic responsibilities, such as voting, were part of the process of integrating a former felon back into society. That's still the assumption in most democracies. In fact, in many countries, inmates can vote even while they're in prison. In the same period, voting rights were also restricted in the North. Leaders of the movement to do so were concerned about the new industrialized working class. And the fact that many of these workers were immigrants was clearly also disturbing to them. As the Democrats' institution of Jim Crow in the South had destroyed the Republican Party as a real contender for power, so too Republicans in the North disliked urban machines, and they disliked immigrant support for such machines. These progressive reformers claimed that political machines were corrupt, and they were clearly right in some cases. This wasn't the reformers' only concern. It was clear that ethnic and racial prejudice informed their views. They seemed skeptical about anybody different from themselves being given the right to vote. They discriminated against the Irish, African Americans, and Chinese immigrants. Although we associate them with the South, literacy tests and poll taxes were put in place in many northern communities. Property requirements were even brought back, at least in many city and town elections. Residency requirements were lengthened in order to prevent recent immigrants from voting, and registration procedures were made longer and as complicated as the reformers could get away with. So the history of American voting rights isn't just a happy story of increasing inclusion. Suffrage has actually expanded at some times and unfortunately contracted at other times. And notwithstanding what us Yankees might like to think, exclusion didn't just occur in the South. Turnout rates for voting went sharply down during this period, and really they never recovered. Don't miss the exciting conclusion of this film, The Magnificent Million: Heroes and Villains of American Voting Rights.